Hey everyone, Ryan North here, and I'd like to take just a few minutes of your time to share with you why I think that a trauma-informed children's ministry is not a luxury, but it is a necessity in the modern world. For years, my wife and I volunteered in children's ministry, and as we were learning more about the brain and attachment and trauma and its impacts, we started putting together some training for children's ministry staff at local churches. Over the years, that has grown, and now we go to communities and train those communities across the country. And when we look at trauma, the reason that I think that it's no longer a luxury but a necessity to understand trauma and its impacts, when we look at our developmental trauma checklist, we've added two things in the last couple of years. One of those is a global pandemic, which we can all agree has had some devastating effects on relationships and developing brains, and also screens. And there's just a lot of data out there about the very, very negative impacts on screens on young children's minds. And so, since everybody was touched by the global pandemic and in some way is likely touched by the devastating impacts of screens, we believe that it's no longer a luxury to understand trauma and how it impacts our relationships, but it is now a necessity. It is time for the church to be the light of the world, to be the city on the hill that Jesus talks about. I want to talk to you just a little bit, if I can, in this video, but kind of how we got to where we are. Years ago, my wife and I were in Seattle, and she was waiting for me to get ready before we went and spoke at an event, and was going through her Facebook alerts and came across this question in a Facebook group for adoptive and foster parents. And it said, has anyone here found it hard to find a church that fits all of your children's needs? Does such a place even exist? Or am I looking for a unicorn? Now, I wish I could tell you that there were hundreds of people who said, yes, come to our church. But the opposite is true, and that is that there was nobody who said, come to our church. However, there were many, many answers just like these few. As committed Christians previously involved in years of ministry, it has been so difficult, not just for our kids, but for us too. We have had a hard time with this also. Our church is the one I grew up in. We tried looking for other churches before and have not found any we like. We left our church that had been a very important part of our lives for 14 years. It still hurts, but our son was not ever going to be accepted there. And then we stopped going to church. And we sat and talked that day in the car driving to the event about how we were just saddened by the fact that nobody was raising their hand and saying, look, our church is a place where your family will feel safe, welcome, and loved. And so that's when we decided we had to double down on our efforts, not just for churches who had adoptive and foster ministries, not just churches who had taken interest in supporting families, but all churches everywhere needed to understand these principles. Gallup has been charting religious data since the 1960s, 1965 here on the slide. And one of the things I love is that we have a lot of organizations who kind of try to figure out the state of religion in America. Gallup asked this question, to ascertain the importance of religion. Is it very important or is it fairly important? Last year in 2023, 45% of Americans said that religion is very important, while another 26% said that it was fairly important. And those two combined making up important is 71%. You'll notice that in 1965 when Gallup first asked that question, 70% of Americans said that religion was very important. Here it is on a slide, just the data we just talked about. The green line is very important, and you can see the decline over time. The fairly important is the blue, which has just changed and actually increased a little bit over time. But the not very important has increased from single-digit percentages to about 28% in 2023. Another data set we looked at was the importance of religion by generation. Those three clusters, the one on the left, the smallest cluster is those who say religion is the most important thing. The middle cluster is those who say it is an important thing. And then the third cluster on the right is just a combination of the first two clusters. The generations being evaluated here are the silent generation, baby boomers, Gen X, and millennials. And so when we look over on the right at the total importance, 67% of the silent generation said that religion was important, 62 of the baby boomers, 54 Gen X, and then 42% of millennials said that religion is important to them. And so that's significant for a couple of reasons, because as you can see, it's the first generation where less than 50% of the people who make up that generation consider religion to be something important. The other thing that's noticeable about that is that when you look at a little deeper at the data about religion, we find that about 68% of Americans who identify as religious claim to be Christian. So if you multiply 42 by 0.68, you get about 28% of millennials think that Christianity is important. Now, that is something to pay attention to for several reasons. I'll just highlight two. Number one, because it's the first generation where less than half of the members of that generation say that religion is important to them. And that is important for us to note that, because that's a generation of people whose kids should be in our children's ministries. And I know that for a long time now, we've discussed and kind of strategized and try to figure out, how do we stop this mass exodus of the faith when kids go off to college? But I think we have another problem looming, and that is, if we don't turn this around now, the next generation will not have anybody to exit the faith. So now is the time to invest in families and to make sure we're reaching them for Jesus. And we firmly believe that having a children's ministry that understands children and their experiences are a crucial component for that. This slide over here is from a survey done by the Barna Group. They wanted to know if children's programming was the primary reason for church choice. Is that why you chose to attend a church, stay at a church, or leave a church? And when you combine strongly agree with somewhat agree, that's 58%. That means that 58% of parents choose the church their family attends based on how their children are treated in children's ministry. That is a significant data point. This is a picture of the Cathedral de Notre Dame de Paris. Notre Dame, as we just simply shorten it typically. This cathedral is being rebuilt after a devastating fire some years ago. It is a magnificent cathedral, and it's right on the banks of the River Seine. But here's what else is true about this magnificent cathedral, is that it's right in the center of Paris. You'll see the location marker there, the red one with the white cross in the Cathedral Notre Dame de Paris. And then there's a ring road around that. It's called the Central Quarter of Paris, which means that that famous cathedral is in the center of the city, which is pretty typical of medieval cities. The entire city was built around the cathedral. The church used to be the actual identifiable geographic center of the community. It was the center of everything in the community. It was the thing that all of life rotated around. Now, I'm not suggesting that we're going to get an opportunity to put the church at the center of the community geographically. But what I am suggesting is now is the time for us to put the church back at the center of our community culturally. This is the law of diffusion of innovation, and this holds for any product or idea. Okay, so when we look at this just distribution over here, 2.5% are the innovators, and then the next 13.5% are the early adopters. Once we get to about 16%, then the next 38, the early majority, and then another 38, the late majority, happens pretty quickly. And that's when we have mass adoption of an idea or a product. And then the 15% laggards, there's an assumption that about 15% of any population will not go along with an idea or with a product. And we don't even try to reach them typically. So I'll give you a couple of examples. When the first iPhone came out in 2007, did not have broad appeal. Just real techie people and Apple people were on board with that at first. Well, by the time we got to the iPhone 3G, that's when the early adopters started using the phones, and that grew to that 16%. And when we hit that tipping point, mass appeal happened. And not only did mass appeal happen, but other producers entered into the smartphone marketplace at that point. Now, the same thing holds with Stanley Cups. Early innovators, those are the 2.5% of people who the only other time they'd seen the word Stanley was on the sliding doors walking into the grocery store, perhaps. But those innovators, at least, they bought the product. Well, then the early adopters, and now, I don't know any of my wife's friends that don't own a Stanley tumbler because it has now got mass appeal. We work from innovator through early adopter to tipping point faster these days because of social media influencers. And so I think the time is now for us to get trauma-informed principles into churches so that we can hit that tipping point. And then the majority of churches, and pretty soon, it will not be something that you do as a luxury, but it'll be something that you do as part of just your church's ministry. So how do we get there? There are 350,000 Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox churches in America. 16% of those would be 56,000 churches. 2.5% would be 8,750. Well, we've got about 400 churches already with our training, or 4.6 of 8,750. So there's a lot to do. We cannot do it alone. It's like the old African proverb says, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. And we want to build a coalition of like-minded individuals and organizations who want to help churches understand that our experiences impact the way we relate to each other and ultimately the way we think about Jesus. So here are just a couple of endorsements of the training from people who've been around it before. Jason Johnson from CAFO says that Ryan and Kayla are experts in trauma-informed children's ministry. They are the best I know on the subject. Courtney Ross from Care Portal says that Ryan and Kayla have an incredible model to train churches to make this spaces safe and effective for the most vulnerable in the community. I have researched the best trauma training for churches, organizations, and more offered, and I find Made to Connect to be the best. I brought them to my local community and can say there's been a marked rise in individuals served through Care Portal, attending local trauma-informed churches who have created safe, welcoming spaces. So what happens there is we went down to Tampa. Those churches got more motivated to help. They started responding to posted needs by Care Portal. And then families started checking out those churches and find environments where they and their children were safe, welcome, and loved. Jackie Overton from Church of the Redeemer in Sarasota says that Ryan and Kayla bring a fresh perspective to children's ministry by encouraging us to consider the whole child. With practical steps for application and reliable stories from real-life experiences, Made to Connect is one of the most enjoyable training events I've ever participated in. The perfect mixture of psychology, neuroscience, and theology helps those in attendance better understand the children in their ministries. I love these kinds of statements from people who have participated in the training, to know that it does help create the kinds of spaces where children and their families can feel safe, welcome, and loved. Here's a quote from Dr. Bruce Perry. If you're not familiar with Dr. Perry's work, he is an amazing person. That is, his work on understanding trauma and its impacts on people, particularly children, has made the world a better place for many, many people. He says the more healthy relationships a child has, the more likely he will be to recover from trauma and thrive. Relationships are the agents of change, and the most powerful therapy is human love. And we believe that the place where children should learn that relationships are valuable and where relationships should be life-changing and whether they should learn that love is the most powerful therapy is in the church today. We have to remember that children heal where they feel safe. And so here's our equation where people feel safe, they can build relationships, and behaviors change. If you want behaviors to change, you have to build relationships. In order to build relationships, people have to feel safe, because we want Sunday morning to move from what is in a lot of cases a behavior management exercise. We want it to move to a place where children can build relationships. And one of the things we have to do is create the sense of felt safety or psychological safety for them to be in our ministry spaces. Thanks for listening. And if you have any questions, my email address is on the bottom of the screen. Just drop us an email. We would love to talk.